So everyone, welcome today to this fantastic event that we have planned here at a beautiful event gallery, the Pulitzer. I would like to introduce myself, Greg Gorman, with the Japan America Society. I'm the president here. I'm also a representative of Nidec Motor Corporation, which is one of the corporate members for the Japan America Society of St. Louis. So, in terms of the Japan America Society and the events that we do, there's a lot of programming that we have, and I'd like to introduce some of those programs to you. So, obviously, the big event that we do every year is the Japanese Festival, which was recently held over the Labor Day weekend, and it was very well attended. Obviously, with the COVID situation, it's been a little bit difficult, and it was a restart after 1-year hiatus. At the festival, we had a number of different activities that were going on. They were cultural in nature. There was the bonsai, there was ikebana, there was a number of just the cuisine that everybody was able to enjoy. The other programs that we do throughout the year, earlier this year, we had a Geostrategy Summit, which was led by Senator Talent. Senator Talent is the previous senator here in Missouri. And it was a very exciting program to talk about the North Asia security situation with some very fantastic guest speakers that were experts on the area. Other events that we've done through the year is the Red Lantern Festival, which we were a co-sponsor of with the JACL. That was with Heidi Hamamura and was a very well attended event. I would like to thank also the corporate sponsors that we have. Nidec is one of those. We also have CSI Leasing, Banner, and you also get a little get to enjoy a little bit later Urban Chestnut, some of the beer that has been produced in collaboration with Masumi Sake, which is our sister city brewery that comes out here every once in a while for the Japanese festival. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Peter Kelly, who is the president of the National Association of Japan America Societies, and he is one of the sponsors for this event and has basically arranged to establish this event today. So please put your hands together for Mr. Peter Kelly. Peter.
Thank you, Greg. I'm Peter Kelly of the National Association of Japan America Societies. It's great to be here in St. Louis. Today I learned that St. Louis is the home of the donut. And welcome to those who are here in person and to the many of you who are joining online. There are 38 Japan America Societies around the United States. All of them are locally managed and locally funded. And their mission is to promote relationships, people-to-people relationships between Japan and the United States at the local level. This society here in St. Louis, the Japan America Society of St. Louis, has an over 50-year history doing just that. The National Association of Japan America Societies, where I work, is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And our role is to provide Japan-related content to those 38 Japan America Societies. We offer program series in partnership with funders in public affairs, in what's called Geostrategy, the program that Greg mentioned a few minutes ago that had Senator Talent and Ambassador Scheer. We also offer programs, business speaker series, and a program related to the security interests between the United States and Japan. Tonight's program is our cultural program called the Richard J. Wood Art Curator Series. Started in 2015, the purpose is to highlight the collections of Japanese art in American museums, both the art itself, but also the collectors. Why are these collections where they are? We invite curators of those collections of Japanese art in American museums to speak at Japan America Societies in cities away from their home museums. And they help to add a sense of the importance of the collections themselves, but the role that art has played in the US-Japan relationship since the opening of relations in the middle of the 19th century. In this year, we are doing 8 presentations in different parts of the country. Tonight's presentation will feature Frank Feltens of the Frick Gallery in Washington, D.C. And you'll understand at the end of the talk why there is a museum of Japanese art on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in an Italianate building named the Frick Gallery. An interesting story and also part of the collection. Other presenters in this series in events that will be upcoming also include Sarah Thompson of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, talking about their collection of ukiyo-e. Dakin Hart of the Noguchi Museum in Brooklyn, New York, talking about the importance of Noguchi, and he'll be doing that in both Kansas City and Detroit, where there are significant Noguchi collections. And finally, Rhiannon Paget of the Ringling Museum in Sarasota, Florida, talking about modern ukiyo-e. Together, these represent a review of those collections of art in the United States, and we hope you'll enjoy them. Please feel free to join the future presentations as well as tonight's. These presentations wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the curators. We are very grateful to all of the curators, including Frank Feltens, for taking the time to make these presentations. He would love to be here, and we miss having him here, but hopefully we'll have another opportunity in the future. Also, our host museums, the Pulitzer Arts Foundation here has been a wonderful partner in this program, both this time and in the previous presentation 4 years ago. And to the host society, the Japan America Society of St. Louis, I want to extend particular thanks to Chip Meyer and Lacey Kirkwist of the Pulitzer Arts Foundation for putting together the virtual portion of this program. This is the first time we've tried to do these in a virtual format, and we hope that you will all enjoy it. And it's now my pleasure, speaking of the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, to introduce representing our host, to introduce Yoko Kioi. Yoko is originally from Wakayama, Japan, but she's also a product of the Midwest. She studied psychology and fine arts at Washington University here in St. Louis and has a master's in art education from the Art Institute of Chicago. At the Pulitzer, she conducts research on education, public engagement, and audience development to create an inclusive, learner-centered environment here at the Pulitzer. Yoko?
Hello, and welcome to the Pulitzer Arts Foundation. Thank you for being here this evening. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. My name is Yoko Kioi. I'm the Assistant Curator of Education here at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation. A little background about me. I grew up in Japan, like Peter said, in the countryside of Wakayama near Osaka. It's basically Midwest of Japan, like St. Louis, but a lot smaller. And I came to the U.S. for college to study art and education. Now working at the Pulitzer in this special building as a Japanese person and as a staff, I am so honored and privileged to be this part of this event tonight. So before I introduce Dr. Feltens, I'd like to take a moment to share some information about the Pulitzer. So the Pulitzer Arts Foundation is an art museum that offers meaningful experience with art and architecture. We bring art and people together to explore ideas and inspire new perspectives. Since its founding in 2001 by Emily Rao Pulitzer, the museum has presented art from around the world in its celebrated building designed by Tadao Ando. As many of you know, Ando is a world-renowned architect from Osaka, Japan. This is a concept sketch image of the prospective building by Ando. The Pulitzer marked his first freestanding public building in the United States. Ando and the founder worked closely together to design this building. And for Ando, elements like light, water, and nature are central to the experience of the art within. They are also central to experiencing the art within this building. As you can see here, you can enjoy the play of light and shadow as you walk around both indoor and outdoor locations. The juxtaposition of man-made and natural elements in Ando's work really highlight the beauty throughout the building, and it provides a perfect place for meditation and contemplation. Unique exhibitions such as Rususawa in 2019, picture here, in this intimate spaces of our galleries, deliver unparalleled experiences and celebrate the union of art and architecture. At the Pulitzer, we have 3 artworks permanently on view: Blue Black, right here, by Ellsworth Kelly. It's a site-specific wall sculpture installed in a main gallery here, right here. And Joe by Richard Setter, a site-specific sculpture made of cotton steel located in the courtyard. And you're welcome to walk through it and to experience, really, feel the magnitude of the sculpture. And Rock City by Scott Burton. It's in the water court. It was installed in the water court a year after we opened the museum, and it serves as a place for the visitor to rest and take in the view. And I want to introduce one of our core philosophies, lead with art. So what that means is that we strive to champion the vision of artists and their contribution to the society. And we work really hard to amplify their voices to build a culture of respect, empathy, and humility through art and programs. And one of the unique features of the Pulitzer, as you might have noticed, that we do not have any labels. That is because we believe that art can be truly powerful, and we can really feel it, experience that, how powerful it can be when we experience it with all senses and with no preconceived notions. So the exhibition at the Pulitzer vary from contemporary shows to historic and solo shows to multi-artist exhibitions. And they're complemented by public programs and events that enhance the art on the view and bring together leaders across disciplines, such as music, poetry, dance, and also activism. So that's it. We appreciate you all joining us this evening. And I want to thank the Japan American Society for proposing to host this event here. And we hope you take a moment after the presentation to enjoy the building, our unique architecture, and the exhibition Hanawoki Art for Life's Sake, currently on view through January 16, 2022. So now let me introduce Dr. Feltens. So Dr. Frank Feltens is a Japan Foundation Associate Curator of Japanese Art at the Freer Gallery of Art and Arthur M. Sakura Gallery at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. He holds a PhD in Japanese art history from Columbia University and has a focus on the late medieval and early modern periods. Dr. Feltens has published and lectured on a range of topics related to Japanese art. Recent articles examine the painters Ogata Korin, Sakai Hoitsu, and the photographer Domon Ken. He has written and co-authored books about Katsushika Hokusai and Zen monk painter Sosen Shukei. He has held research positions at the Museum of Modern Art, the National Museum of Asian Art in Berlin, and Nezu Museum, as well as at the Temple Sensoji in Tokyo. At the Freer and Sakura, Dr. Feltens has organized a number of new exhibitions, including Mind Over Matter, Zen in Medieval Japan, that's upcoming, and Hokusai, Mad About Painting, 2019 through 2021, and as well as Japan Modern, Prints in the Age of Photography, 2018 through 19, Painting the Classics, 2019, and The Way of the Kami, 2019. Dr. Feltens is a longtime practitioner of the Japanese tea ceremony in Urasenke tradition and carries the honorary tea name, Sochaku. His new book, Ogata Korin, Art in Early Modern Japan, published by Yale University Press, is available for pre-order now. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Feltens.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Yoko, for that very kind introduction. And I want to begin by welcoming all of you to this hybrid event. those of you who are at the Pulitzer on site, and also those who, like me, are sitting in their living rooms and are watching this now. And I think all of us are probably slightly jealous of those who have the good fortune of being at the Pulitzer and waiting for those beautiful bento boxes that are coming out later after the talk. I also want to thank the Japan-America Society in St. Louis for hosting this event. And in particular, I want to thank Greg Gorman, as well as Chip Meyer, Christy Binkai, and Linda Austin for their incredible work in making this all happen. I know Chip is behind the scenes, making sure that everything's technologically sound. So thank you for that. And I also, a big thank you to Peter Kelly, the president of the National Association of Japan-America Societies, whose brainchild really these wood lectures are. So I'm incredibly honored and happy to be part of it this year. And last but not least, a huge thank you also to the Pulitzer Arts Foundation and everybody on staff who kindly agreed to host us, and also who is making sure that this webinar is running without any problems. I know this is a very tough and difficult task. This is actually my first hybrid event, so I'm full of awe and incredibly grateful to everybody for making this happen. So today I thought I could share a few bits and pieces about our museum, the Freer Gallery of Art and Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. And our brand is the National Museum of Asian Art, which is really a big part of our identity from the very beginning of the museum. And many of you may not have had the chance to visit the Freer and Sackler. And if you had, you will notice that, this is a museum that has been around for quite some time. And we have the great fortune of looking back onto a history that is very profound, but also in so many ways very much timely, actually, to our own age. And so today I wanted to look a little bit at the evolution of our collection through the lens of some of the masterpieces that our founder, Charles Freer, collected, but also how we as an institution are going beyond those historic precedents that Freer has set, and how we are continuously striving to develop and evolve the Japanese collections in particular. And this doesn't just pertain to Japan, but all the other areas of Asian arts and American art that are represented in this museum. But because Japan was my specialty, I don't dare to talk about anything but Japan today. So for anybody who has not been to the Freer, this is how the building looks like. And I feel, although the Pulitzer, of course, is much newer and much more contemporary in its architecture and in its outlook, I would say, in so many ways too, I think the premises upon which the Freer building was built and is still being used has a lot of overlap with what the Pulitzer is doing, although we do have our own collections with which we are working very heavily. One of those overlaps is really that the architecture of the building in and of itself plays a huge part in our identity and in the way we are doing exhibitions at this museum. So the Freer, and also in addition to that, the location of the museum itself along the National Mall in Washington, alongside all the other, many other Smithsonian units, National Gallery is also there, plays a huge part in the way we do our jobs and in the way we think about Asian arts and Japanese art in my case. So the museum was opened in 1923, so almost exactly 100 years ago. And the architecture, as you can see, is very much a pun or an homage, so to speak, on Italian palazzo, sort of a revivalist style, in a way that you find quite a bit in Gilded Age America in the early 20th century. So I guess there are two ways of looking at this type of use of architecture for a collection that is exclusively Asian arts and some extraordinary American art pieces, which Freer also collected. Why did Freer choose, or why did he want a building like this to host his Asian arts collection? A big part of this is because he really strove and wanted to give Asian arts at that time a stage that is on par with the old masters, or with other grander collections like the national galleries across the world. The American National Gallery did not exist at the time yet, but suffice it to say that he wanted to create a building that is emphatically museum-like, to give Asian arts a forum to be fully recognized as as equal to the masterpieces of Western art, which I think is very forward-looking for his time, and really still applies today. And its location along the National Mall is very important, because also during the time that the Freer Gallery opened in 1923, the museum was the Smithsonian's very first art museum. So the mall looked very different. This was the first art museum along the National Mall in the capital, which I think is a very strong statement that this was not a museum of Western art, but of Asian arts. And I'll say a little bit about the timing and the thoughts behind that in a little bit, but just to say that I also love talking about the quirks and idiosyncrasies of our architecture, because they really do inform what we do. At the outset, when the museum opened, we did not have any electric light. So in 1923, up until basically the post-war era, we did not have any electric lighting in the museum. The only light that came in is through these ceiling windows, which of course are layered and filtered, so they don't let any UV lighting into the building, which is important when you think of the exhibits being very different from oil painting or Western art materials. But Japanese art in particular is very light sensitive, and so is Chinese and Korean. The pigments fade very quickly. So we are making sure by preventing UV light and maintaining a certain luminosity level, not to damage the works. And we also have the rule that we do not display a Japanese painting for more than 6 months over a 5-year span. So those are really rigid rules by which we abide constantly in our exhibition making. But the mix of the blend of natural light and artificial light creates this beautiful play of experiences that you have depending on the seasons when you visit the museum, which I think in so many ways is either intentionally or unintentionally also so close to how Japanese art is being conceived and viewed over centuries through the eyes of the seasons, but also through changing light. This is probably, if you go to the Freer in the evening and say of February, you will like what you see here, but this is a little bit amplified. It's actually a bit darker in reality. You will feel as if you are standing in a Japanese traditional home and looking at these works like they would have originally been conceived. Not in the bright light of a glaring Western art museum, but in the subdued light of traditional architecture. And this is really a unique experience, I think, for visitors to understand how these works were made and what kind of light they were made for, in a way that you will really see how these works are coming together, how these different abstract parts that are the brushstrokes in each work really fuse together to create a synergy and a whole. There are so many different things that I could say about the museum, but there's not so much time to talk about architecture alone, but we really want to look at art together. But like any eponymous museum, we at the Freer Gallery are always obsessed with, and to a degree, with our founder, Charles Leng Freer, because in so many ways, I mean, with so many other museums as well, the vision and the persona of the founders really and their collecting activities in Freer's case really are a touchstone, both to be critical but also to embrace. And Freer certainly is still that for us. We constantly engage with his legacy, both in a critical but also in an embracing way. So Freer is, just to say a few words about his background, he's really one of the the typical success story of the American Gilded Age in a way that he's a rags to riches story come to life in so many ways, because he was born into very humble circumstances in Kingston, New York, quite an isolated place at the time, and still is in the Hudson Valley. And he barely finished, elementary school to like middle school education, and then started working in the railroad business, like so many people of his time, and worked his way up. Showed an incredible aptitude in business matters, and long story short, founded his own string of railroad car production facilities, which he consolidated eventually with his business partners, and really created one of the big empires of American railroad rail car production at the time. And so he moved to Detroit and settled there, and had the great fortune of becoming so wealthy that he was able to retire at age 45 and really devote himself to the arts. And he did that not through Japanese art on the outset, but through American etchings and drawings, mainly by James McNeill Whistler, who was really a big love affair for Freer in terms of art from the very beginning of his collecting activities up until the very end. And Whistler had an outsized impact on the formation of Freer's aesthetic sense, but also on his collecting activities. One of those impacts is in this emphatic use of line and the visibility of the artist's hand that you find in these etchings. I mean, so many works by Whistler and his contemporaries, American painters of his era, that emphasize, the movement of the painter's hand across the paper or the canvas, and the tactility almost of the materials being used. And so this was Freer's first exposure to art, and he was, in very many ways, a self-taught connoisseur. But through the exposure to works like these, but also through his acquaintances and friends who introduced him to more visual experiences and other artists, he really honed his eye. And as he began collecting, his aesthetic sense really started to become very refined, and also in so many ways, and I don't hesitate to say this, very much ahead of his time, in a sense that he did not think of American or Asian arts as one being better than the other, but all of the world arts, be it European, American, or Asian, are connected in one way or another through their use of colors to aesthetics. So he was looking for different points of connections across space and time. And this is really what the core of his collection is really about. And in this quest, he first, allegedly through Whistler's agency, gravitated towards collecting his first pieces of Japanese art in the late 1880s. And so the very first piece of Asian art that he purchased is this fan in the style of Ogata Korin, a very well-known painter from the 17th and 18th century. The work is definitely not authentic, but it kind of shows, and it's not a masterpiece by any standards, but it's important to think and to use this little item as sort of as a touchstone in the genealogy of Freer's aesthetic evolution, really, because you can already see, compared to the etchings before that I showed you before, how he was drawn to the immediacy of the painter's brush. Like here, every line, every wash here on the neck or on the cheeks, on the beak of the crane, all of those immediate and immediately recognizable traces of an artist's hand on the paper. And this is what he cherished more than anything, and where he looked for cross connections across the world and across time as well. And so he very much continued in that vein in the 1890s, where he started by what would become his modus operandi, by buying large bulks of items of Japanese art, Chinese art, various other areas as well. So he rarely bought just a single piece, but he always bought a lot. And so we are constantly also sparsing out which works are better than others. That is still a process that we engage in as curators 100 years after. But in this case, he continued his affection for what he called at that time drawings, Japanese drawings, meaning ink paintings. So works done in monochrome ink or with light colors, such as this one here in the center. The work on the left is in the style of a famous Sesshu, probably the most famous and most well-regarded ink painters of Japan. Sesshu lived in the late 15th, early 16th century. And so this work, along with this here by Kano Tanyo, made about 100 years later, really shows you how Freer paid attention to the brushwork, how these washes appealed to him, how he envisioned the brush moving across the paper. And where he wasn't necessarily looking for some kind of deeper cultural meaning, as it were. So he wasn't projecting any Orientalist sort of notions onto the art, but he was really only just exploring it more than anything through its aesthetic components, which is actually not what many people at the time did predominantly. And but he also, he was also inspired by so many other collectors at the time, and in the sense that he collected a lot of ceramics, mainly for use in the Japanese tea ceremonies, such as this really colorful freshwater container here. And this went on. He purchased, like I said, always in bulk. So one of those big bulk purchases in 1897 was the so-called Prince of Kaga collection, which actually means the feudal lord, the daimyo of Kaga domain, which is now in Ishikawa prefecture on the western shoreline of Japan. The Maeda, who were the lords of that province in the Edo period, were actually well known for their aesthetic sense and for their collecting activity. So this was top-notch provenance to Freer already at the time, although he thought of these feudal lords as princes, which is kind of charming in a sense, but also wrong. But he also gravitated already very early on to famous artists like Hokusai. So he was both influenced by conversations or by discourses and fashions of Japanese art collecting during his time. Hokusai was incredibly popular in the 19th century already, but he also did his own thing. For Hokusai, for example, Freer's idiosyncratic approach to him is that he wasn't interested in Hokusai's prints, like so many other collectors at the time. Think of the Great Wave, that is a print, not a painting. But Freer collected paintings, which is actually quite different from what usually people brought together, and during his time. So this is one of the reasons why we are so fortunate actually to have such an incredibly good and big collection of Hokusai's paintings and drawings in the collection. So this all goes back to this early training in the arts in a sense. And then as he is traveling, Freer went to Japan in 1895 for the first time. And if you read his travel diaries, you see a man traveling as a tourist. It's almost like he had a Lonely Planet type of travel guide in front of him and had to check all the different destinations. So, for example, he went to Kiyomizu-dera, he went to Kinkakuji, the Golden Temple, he went to all the sites that a contemporary tourist today in Kyoto, for example, or other places would not want to miss. He didn't meet with famous people. He was just traveling around in his rickshaw, as gentlemen, I guess, did at the time. For better or for worse, and he was taking in the sights. He went there as a tourist, but that experience still had a big impact on him in a way that he returned to America and started buying much better quality works, such as this wonderful screen up here by Kano Eto, a very important 16th century representative of the Kano school, which had such an outside impact on Japanese art, but also more delicate tea wares, such as this tea bowl here by Honami Koretsu, which is actually the only original in a collection outside Japan. So Freer was his collecting in so many ways brought together a lot of masterpieces, but it also had a lot of hit and miss moments, which of course I'm leaving out for today, because I do want us to look at wonderful things together. But a big impact on Freer's collecting was he received from Ernest Fenollosa, the American pioneer in Japanese art studies, who taught for many years in Japan and brought together a substantial collection of Japanese art, which he then brought back with him to Boston, where he became the first curator of Japanese or Oriental antiquities, as it was then called. Always makes me cringe, but that was the title, I guess. And Fenollosa, as much of an impact as he had on the art world at the time through his writings and through advisory capacities. I mean, this is the kind of collecting pattern that you still find today among many collectors, where they, where there is a blend of outside of advisors and also their own tastes that then form their collection. So Freer was no exception there. And Fenollosa, like I said, had a really strong impact on him, but not just by giving him advice on what to buy, but also by selling him pieces from his own collection. So this painting here on the left, the Hibokannon, which is a modern rendering of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who is known as this genderless deity who is sort of the protector of mothers and children, but in generally speaking, also known as the Bodhisattva of mercy, so a benevolent being that is very popular in Japanese Buddhism and in paintings. But this work here, made under the guidance of Fenollosa, actually, who had a huge impact on painters like Kano Hogai, renders this ancient bodhisattva with the Virgin Mary in mind. So this is a hybrid work that sort of brings together Christian symbolism with Buddhism for the purpose of displaying it in an exhibition, rather than this was never made for a temple or a religious context, but for a exhibition framework. So and Freer purchased this very important work from Fenollosa directly, who was perpetually having financial problems, and then perfectly fitting for the story of a Washington, D.C. institution such as ours, a geopolitical event had a major impact on the formation of the Freer Gallery of Art. So Freer, as he was collecting these masterpieces, was trying to find a place for them to be given to and to exist and be displayed and be looked after after his death. And he approached several institutions, including the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian was very reluctant to actually accept Freer's gift because it considered itself as an institution focusing on science, not on the arts at the time. So there was no art collection at the Smithsonian. So they said, why would we need this one now? And then this geopolitical event called the Russo-Japanese War happened between 1904 and 1905, when for the very first time an Asian nation, meaning the Empire of Japan at the time, defeated a Western imperialist power in a war, the Russian Empire. And this event its geopolitical impacts and ripple effects cannot be overstated in a way that it spawned and inspired independence movements from Egypt to Turkey to India to Southeast Asia. This had a huge impact on the world. The between Japan and Russia was brokered by Teddy Roosevelt in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905. And so this event impressed upon Roosevelt the importance of acknowledging and learning about the cultures of Asia, more specifically Japan at the time. So he was seeing, for lack of a better word, the emergence of something like an Asian century, which is such an overused term that we still use today, but it was a present kind of understanding of the shifting geopolitical power dynamic. And I think we're seeing that very much now with the American foreign policy very much targeting the Indo-Pacific and places like that right now. So all the circumstances that Roosevelt saw in 1905 are not entirely different from what we are seeing today. So hence, Freer's collection retains its relevance because Roosevelt thought in order to prevail, so to speak, or in order to understand the cultures of East Asia and Asia in the broadest sense, one important aspect to do so was through its culture. So he urged the regions of the Smithsonian to actually accept Freer's offer of a gift, which they then did in 1906. So the Russo-Japanese War and Roosevelt's agency resulting from it had eventually culminated in the establishment of the Freer Gallery and of the acceptance of Freer's gift of art and funds to sustain the museum. Which I always think is a really important and meaningful background for the museum as a whole. And so after Freer did that, and after he became associated with the President of the United States, had given his collection to the Smithsonian, the National Museum of America, as it was understood at the time, he returned to Japan in 1907 and was embraced as the grand benefactor. He was a star, and immediately he didn't come back to Japan as a tourist, but as a celebrity. And suddenly all doors opened at once, and Freer was welcomed into the homes of the leading industrialists, self-made millionaires like him, such as Hara Tomitaro, who was a silk manufacturer at the time. And many of these industrialists, like Freer, cultivated themselves through art and through collecting. So he found these like-minded people in Japan with whom he then started a vivid exchange through letters, through meetings, but also through art. So a few works in our collection, such as this important handspot in the 14th century that shows a poetic contest between workmen, which is sort of a legendary occurrence from the 12th century, was given to Freer by Hara as a token of friendship. And so many of the works that we do have in our collection are not just historically important, but also their stories and their trajectories towards Freer's collection embody his social network, his thinking, and in so many ways, are representative of so much more than the object itself. And I think that is true for many museums, with a bit of a history. And so much so was Freer cherished in Japan that he was given this monument more than a decade after he passed away that still stands in the Temple Koetsuji in Kyoto. And by all means, I do not want to sing only laurel about Freer's collecting and about his persona, but I do want to of course, we are always engaging with him in a critical way as well. But for today's purpose, I did want to bring out some of the more forward-thinking aspects of his collecting and how the establishment of the museum, how the timing of his offer to the Smithsonian, how all these things sort of created this very intricate and meaningful web of events and perspectives onto Asia and its cultures that are not irrelevant for our own time. So there are many. I always believe that there are many lessons to be learned from those as well. And Freer kept collecting on a big scale. I mean, one of the great masterpieces in our collection that is also very close to my heart, because in grad school I worked very much on Sotatsu and his lineage. Is this fantastic screen of the waves of Matsushima, which is sort of place with vision and perception. You see on the right screen these islands in the stormy sea, and then your eyes go up here to this seemingly band of clouds that in the screen on the left, you have to imagine these next to each other, morphs into not air, but a sandbank. So and then you have this amorphous shape here, which could be a cloud, a sandbank, something. And if the screens are folded and standing, they lose this flatness, which they have here on the screen, but really create an almost uncanny sense of three-dimensionality, which you don't expect from a work like this. So, and it's we have 2 pairs of only 6 screens by Sotatsu that survive. So this is really, we can consider ourselves very lucky to have these fantastic works in the collection. Moving on away from Freer for the last 15 minutes that I have, by thinking about how the collection evolved from the time of Freer, because every museum that actively collects needs to ask itself the question: how do you want to expand the collection? Do you want to expand the collection? How do you want to do this? And what kind of impact, both on the collections onto the broader scheme of things, do you want to have? And as a curator, I found, I've only been at the Freer for 5 years now, pretty much, so relatively new, but I do ask myself the question constantly: how is the collection going to be perceived in 100 years' time? So as a curator, or more actually, so how do you collect in a meaningful way that it stands the test of time and will have meaning and importance and significance way beyond your own lifetime? Because as a curator, obviously, you're just a custodian of what is within your museum. You come and go, but the objects stay. And this is even more true for the Freer, because we never deaccession anything that is part of our bylaws. And the second thing, all works in the Freer Gallery of Art's collection can never leave the building. That is part of Freer's stipulations in his last will. And every new work that is added to the collection, because we do actively collect, and many works were brought into the Freer. So Freer's original collection of Japanese art was 1,500 pieces, and now it is 6,500 in the Freer alone. That doesn't count anything that is in the Sackler. All of those fall under this restriction of that we cannot lend any of it, but we can also not bring in any loans into the building either. So we can never display anything in our museum that is not part of our collection. That's very idiosyncratic and very different from any Asian art museum or collection that I know in America. But it also gives us a lot of, makes us think doubly about any new purchase and any new acquisitions. And also it imposes upon us a stronger sense of sustainability too, in so many ways, because if a work cannot leave the building, it is exposed to less stress, as a matter of fact. That is one of the benefits. Of course, I would love to send parts of our collection back to Japan in particular, in order to for people there to enjoy them as much as we do. But being on an airplane is never good for any work of art. But in Japanese art, and its fragility of pigments is particularly prone to stress onto the works. So there are various ways in which you can interpret this rule, but we always abide by it, of course. And new acquisitions were made quite early. If you remember that the Freer Gallery was opened in 1923, 6 years after already, the museum purchased this important 12th century mandala. And fast forward in time, we keep expanding, especially the Buddhist art collection and other areas as well, through gifts and targeted purchases. So in the 2000s, we were fortunate to receive a substantial gift of calligraphies, of which you see one of my favorite examples here, the so-called Burned Sutra, which is a 11th century Buddhist text, a fragment of the Flower Ornament Sutra, the Kegonkyo, that was rescued from the burning sub-temple of Todaiji in Nara in 1667, when the building burned to the ground. Afterwards, the monks were seeding through the ashes, trying to find surviving icons and images, and found a set of sutras that magically have survived, rolled up. And they became such a treasured possession that fragments of them have been disseminated into various collections, and one of them is with us since 2014. But also this tiny Buddhist sculpture from the 7th century is one of my favorite pieces, because Buddhism came to Japan in the 6th century in the form of a sculpture very much like this, allegedly, of the Buddha at birth, being born from the side of his mother and pointing to the heavens and earth and walking in each direction, declaring himself the savior of the cosmos, basically, of everything. And this sculpture, you have to imagine, is not bigger than your palm. So this is exactly the kind of work that was carried in the trunk, in the suitcase, so to speak, of a Korean envoy in the 6th century to Japan in order to introduce this new religion to the country, which of course had a tremendous impact on the formation of Japanese culture as we know it today. So in other words, many of the acquisitions that we are making into the museum, both through gifts and especially through purchases, have to be outstanding. I mean, for lack of a better word, the purchases in particular, but also collections, gifts have to be in so many ways important works of art, because our goal is not to fill gaps in the collection or to create an encyclopedic museum by any means, but our aspiration is to display and really teach about the cultures of Asia, or in this case Japan, through the best works possible, or through the best works that we can get. And oftentimes that is not possible because it is outside of our financial reach, or things are not available. But in the early 2000s, this wonderful monumental work of one of the early saints, so to speak, of Buddhism in Japan, Shotoku Taishi, was purchased. And it was at the time the most expensive Japanese art purchase that we've ever made up until 2001. And there were many reasons for going after this work, which obviously precedes my tenure at the museum. But Freer actually saw this work in Japan at one point in the collection of Baron Kuki Ryuichi, a politician and statesman, and he wanted to acquire the work from Kuki and was unable to do so. And then roughly 100 years after, this work popped up, was rediscovered and offered to the museum. And luckily, we were able to bring it into the Freer collection in the way that Freer had intended to do already, a century before. But it's not just Freer's own attachment to the work, but its historic importance, of course, that gave a strong impetus, because this is such an early work from the 13th century. And the way Shotoku is depicted is so emphatically archaic that it is looking back even further it's trying to imagine what the time of Shotoku Taishi, the 7th century, looked like. So this is sort of almost for lack of a better word, a Renaissance look back onto a certain antiquity, a notion of antiquity in Japan, where the early stages of Buddhism, the clothing, the demeanor, the thinking of those times were being imagined centuries after. And this work here is one of the most recent acquisitions, purchases, actually the last purchase that was made for Japanese art in 2014. This is as far as we would go for the Freer originally up until this time. So into the mid-19th century, but not beyond, for a variety of reasons. The thinking at the time was to keep the collection concise within its pre-modern scope, as it were. So moving into Japan's modernity was not as much on the agenda as it would be now. And so the last targeted purchase that we made is actually also one of the newer, more recent works from the mid-19th century, in a way that it's it's one of Ikeda Koson's recent new discoveries. The screen was just discovered right before it was acquired, it beautifully mixes. If you can see here the floating maple leaves on the screen, it beautifully mixes traditional forms of expression in a way that you saw in the Matsushima screens, for example, and more Western inspired or Chinese inspired notions of naturalism, in the way that you can see here in the mirroring of the leaves floating on the water, for example. So there's this interplay, this symbiosis between stylization and naturalism, which I find incredibly appealing, and really foreshadows also a lot of things that were happening in Japanese style painting then in the modern age as well. And I want to close by introducing just the most recent additions to the museum, because they really do set a very new direction for us at the Freer and really made us think about the museum and the next century and more as we are approaching our centennial. In 2018, we were offered a part of the collection of Mary and Cheney Coles, of a couple of collectors in Seattle. And Mary and Cheney collect in the broadest sense. I mean, they collect from early Japanese art through contemporary. And the collection is so vast that we were asked to pick which works we wanted to have and why. And we sat together as curators and we're thinking, okay, well, what could the biggest impact of this collection be on the evolution of our collection as we are moving into the next century? And our idea was that we wanted to use this opportunity to make use of Mary and Cheney's exceptional collection of especially modern works. So from the 19th century into the 20th, and really open the Freer up for works of that time frame, while we hadn't accessioned any works from that time previously. So we made that case and were fortunate enough to receive about 260 works of two categories: one, modern paintings and calligraphies from the late 19th into the late 20th century, but also Edo period and earlier works inspired by Chinese traditions, or the so-called literati works. And Tomioka Tessei, whom you see here, is a perfect example of this literati tradition, because he lived at the juncture between Edo period Japan and the Meiji era, so the time when Japan modernized. And he linked those two ends of the 19th century perfectly in his works, in a way that he looked back towards China, not Europe or America, as a touchstone for formulating a modern identity for Japan. And he did so through his writings, but also through his artworks, by giving these old ancient pigments and painting materials a very new feel. For example, by crowding the pictures with these emphatically dense and dramatic brushworks and compositions, but also imbuing his works with always a cheeky side, such as this one here, Blind Man Praising an Elephant, which is looks like. The one touching his tail thinks an elephant looks like a brush. The one feeling the foot thinks an elephant is a pillar, and so on. So the meaning of that story is you need to understand the whole in order to grasp its totality, not just its parts. Don't judge a book by its cover, so to speak. And then the collection carries on by bringing to us this reinterpretations, new interpretations of traditional styles of Japanese style painting from the 20th century by artists such as Terasaki Kogyo and Kawabata Ryushi, both artists who are very much sponsored by the Japanese government at the time. Kawabata in particular was a very famous painter at the time, and you even find works by him in the Japanese embassy in Washington here. So, and then what is even more meaningful of an impact of the Coase collection is its move into the post-war era, because that is really a territory that we did not touch in accessioning into the FREER previously. But why did we decide to still accession these works into the FREER and not into the SACRA, for example, into the other collection that we preside over, which is much more flexible? One of those reasons is that all of these styles, such as here by Munakata Shiko, whose production context could not be more 20th century, but the style, the materials are all somehow related in one way or another to the older traditions that preceded. But they reconfigure those traditions in a completely new and meaningful way. So they are a natural extension of that older time. But at the same time are not frozen or are not enslaved to that tradition, but really bring out a new vital force from traditional Japanese painting in so many ways. And Munakata does this both through his incredibly expressive brushwork, which almost always reminds me of Chagall in so many ways, but also by the way he painted these. He went to say museums such as the Tokyo National Museum and sketched these sculptures, such as this Bodhisattva sculpture here in situ in a modern museum, and then went home and created paintings such as this one on the basis of his sketches. So that is a production process that is very much 20th century and did not exist in traditional Japan. And then moving forward in terms of calligraphy, there are works, of course, that you cannot ignore by avant-garde artists from the Japanese post-war era, such as Suda Kokta, who was a Kansai area-based artist who reinterpreted Zen calligraphy in his own very specific way and was very much drawn to this, one of the early proponents of Zen in Japan, Dogen, from the 13th century, and was reimagining sort of what is the meaning of these early Zen writers' writings, and how can I translate that into my contemporary art pieces, and how do I fuse it in a meaningful way with my avant-garde attitude. And I think Suda Kokta managed to do that in a very striking and completely mesmerizing way by using these old, huge brushes, by keeping his ink emphatically rough to create these bubbles here. This is a modern work, if there ever was one, but it's still very much embedded in consciously embedded, and expands the tradition. And in that way, I want to close by just taking a brief look at this work here, which is from the 1960s, and really also opens up a new field of study, because Suda Kokta is already a part of many Asian art collections around the world, in particular in Europe, where this type of calligraphy was collected more avidly than in American museums. One of the more mysterious and more interesting, more striking artists is Mikami Makoto, who belong to the Kyoto-based avant-garde movement called Pan-Real, which is if you think about exhibitions at major museums like MoMA or who tackle Japanese avant-garde, the focus will almost exclusively be on Tokyo and the post-war era. The Kansai area, Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe, is very much a nascent field of study. And the wonderful thing about some of Mary and Cheney's collecting activities, they do focus very much on that part of Japan and its artistic production, and how artists like Mikami Makoto looked towards Japanese traditional materials, had a traditional painting background, but through their avant-garde manifesto, such as through this Pan-Realism society that he co-founded, try to transcend traditional expressions to create something completely visceral and almost scientific. So a combination between the visceral, the completely impulsive, but also the scientific. And this combination is embodied here wonderfully in the way that he is creating a imagined star chart on the basis of ancient symbols, but he is imagining those symbols through traditional Japanese paper and ink. So in that sense, the work is very firmly embedded in the post-war era, but also looks back so much further back in time. I realize that the last part might have been a little bit confusing, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Thank you for your question on the pottery part. That is just a question of time, really, because I couldn't cover every area that we collect in Japanese art, and one of those that I completely left out almost is also sculpture, which we do have a substantial collection in. And so I believe, part of these wood lectures, as part of these wood lectures, my former colleague Louise Court, who's so much knowledgeable in ceramics, has talked about them at some point. And also, I should say that my area of specialty is painting and calligraphy, so this is what I usually tend to focus on, and that's also the part of the collection that I deal with mostly.
The Freer Gallery also has all of Charles Lang Freer's notes, and I understand. Can you tell us something about what he thought his most favorite pieces in the collection were?
Freer's favorite pieces? Well, Freer did not have such a big habit of writing about the works that he loved most. I mean, his diary is more of a log rather than a manifesto in so many ways. But I do know for a fact that Freer was very much enthused by Hokusai's works. So there are a number of, that is one of the reasons why we have such a substantial collection of Hokusai's paintings, drawings, and sketches. So that is really something that Freer was incredibly drawn to. And the evidence for that is not just the quality of the collection, but also the sheer number of the works too. And also, I do know that Freer, through Finalosa, for example, was very much loved Sotatsu's work. So the Waves at Matsushima is one of Freer's, most certainly one of Freer's favorite pieces. And that is just a couple from the Japan collection. I think in the other areas, there are definitely more, such as the Codex Washingtonensis, one of the early Bible manuscripts that we have in the collection that Freer bought in Egypt during one of his travels. That is really one of his favorite works, if you want to call it that, because of its historic importance and also its rarity altogether.
So my question relates to the requirement that the pieces stay inside the gallery and that you're not able to loan them out. You said that was in the bylaws, but was that a specific request from Freer that he wanted that there, or how did that develop? Why is that in the bylaws?
Yes. So why can't we loan anything or bring anything into the museum? Yeah, this is part of Freer's bequest to the Smithsonian. He explicitly didn't want his collection to be traveling all the time, and that is the reason for that. There are actually several reasons for that. One of them I mentioned is conservation concerns, that he wanted things to stay in either prior to the building of the museum, the works rarely left his home in Detroit, where he actually had two conservators and a curator working on the pieces and preserving them. And when the collection entered the Smithsonian's Freer Gallery, then the same principles applied, in the sense that Freer, through his bequest, didn't want us to lend any works, or not because he always wanted to have them available for study. That was his big concern, aside from conservation. He wanted the collection to be accessible at all times for people to come and examine and study it. So actually, this is also still one of the contracts that we have with Freer, that we uphold to honor his legacy by making the works accessible for study. And anyone can basically request a viewing of most works through our collections management. The only works that are a bit off limits are the most important pieces, because we don't usually there are many other concerns that we for why we don't have anybody just take a peek at them in storage. But yeah, long story short, study and conservation are the big reasons for Freer having decided in his bequest that the museum cannot lend. But we can add new pieces to the Asian collections, but not to the American either. That is, the American collection by Freer's bequest is completely frozen in time. He didn't want anything to be added there.
So do you know any Japanese artist that does haiku calligraphy?
I must say that I admire whoever is typing the questions in the chat, because you must be a very quick typer. I'm not that guy. Don't have that type of skill, and it's kind of funny to be sitting here and waiting for a question to pop up in the chat. It feels very isolated here. Yes, haiku calligraphy. Yeah, we do have a couple of works that, for example, we have a letter by Matsuo Basho. And not as many. I mean, most of the calligraphy that we have are either Buddhist texts or classical poetry, letters, and haiku not so much. But they do pop up, especially in some of our printed books collections. Like the Pulitzer collection, it's about 2,200 titles. It's all online. If you go onto pulver.si.edu, you can access them all. And there are a number of haiku collections there, for example.
More questions?
Yes, I do have a personal favorite, and mine will always be The Waves at Matsushima. I love that work, and I think it's one of the first pieces I saw as a graduate student coming down to DC from New York, and then we went into Freer storage, and there it was, standing right there all by itself. And that experience is something that you don't forget. It was really mesmerizing, and every time I see that work, either in an exhibition upstairs or in storage downstairs, I feel the same way. It's just you never. It's one of those pieces that you don't grow tired of, and that you always have sort of in a special place in your heart. But I should say that there are many more works in the collection that I love almost equally, if not. So you can. You can like one of your children more than the others in a sense. So I have to be impartial. But yeah, since you asked, I think Waves at Matsushima is really my personal favorite.
Any more questions? Okay. Well, if you have any question, please come talk to us. We can email Dr. Feltens. Please.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so
very
much.
much for joining us today. Thank you for being on site at the Pulitzer, and thank you to all of you who joined us via the Zoom video stream. It was so much fun to talk to you, although I can't see you, but I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you.
Thank you.